that's, some of the reasons why we're going to be having this event to talk about today. So yes, so you are recorded. It's good to record your heads. We're going to put this on the Deadline Club website later on. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce some of our wonderful panelists who are joining us here tonight. So starting at my far right, we have Austin Jefferson. He is the Associate State Politics Reporter for City and State, and he covered several New York congressional and assembly races this year. Next to him there is Alyssa Katz, the Executive Editor with The City, where she leads high impact and accountability reporting on New York City, including investigations, data projects, and economic coverage. Next is Sally Goldenberg, Senior New York Editor at Politico. She joined the team in 2013 to cover the administration of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, with a focus on budget and labor contracts. And last but not least, on the end there, our moderator for tonight is Erin King Sweeney, Senior Associate Director of Cornell University's Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. A practicing attorney, Erin was a councilwoman and majority leader in the town of Hempstead and a staunch advocate of downtown development and economic opportunity. And a special thanks to Erin and Cornell Tech for hosting us for this event. They don't do a lot of these sorts. They don't have a journalism program at Cornell Tech, and yet they still allowed us to intrude upon them and have this event. They've been really wonderful hosts to give us this great space of a gorgeous view. So we appreciate that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. But without further ado, I'll pass it along to Erin, and thank you all for having this conversation with us today.
Sure, Nick. Thank you for having us. And a special thank you to Cornell Tech for hosting this. And on behalf of Congressman Steve Israel, who heads up the Cornell Institute of Politics with me, we're really delighted to be here. We always love such a wonderful view in New York City. And I guess it's a little bit of a better view than Ithaca these days. It's a little cold up at Cornell right now. But thank you all for coming out on a cold night. And thank you to my panelists here for spending your evening with us. And so Nick mentioned that I'd been involved in local politics on Long Island. I was a scrum of politics on Long Island. I was sort of born and raised in it and was in office for 5 years, and sort of had an interesting vantage point because I was on the Hempstead Town Board with both Laura Gillen and Anthony D'Esposito, who ran against each other 2 years ago. Anthony won, and now this time Laura won. So the dynamics of all these local political races and having such an impact nationally is sort of fascinating to me. And I had a front row seat to some of those fun conversations we had on the Hempstead Town Board. But so I'm trying to bring tonight's conversation at the national level a little bit locally to New York, but obviously we're going to talk about President-elect Trump, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and what it all means for New York going forward. So my question to the panel to kick it off, there's been a lot of conversation about the role of podcasts in the election. Is the national media still relevant? Are we still going to have a CNN and Fox in 4 years?
I mean, I can't see how not. I mean, for better or for worse, my father still gets a lot of his information from Fox News and he votes. I mean, I think that's still a resource a lot of people rely upon.
Yeah, this is working, right? I think we're in a really multi-layered media environment that's very segmented in a lot of different ways, but by generation, by culture, by geography. And so you have certain demographics that are very reliant still, like your father, right, on mass media like cable. And I have a Gen Z child, and that's not, except when she's visiting her grandmother, that's not how she's getting her news. So I think we're seeing a generational change. And I think the question for us in media about politics, and especially about local politics, but true of national as well, is in this media environment where, the generation coming up is getting its information from social media, is starting to tune it out. I know my child is, because it's so overwhelming at this point. How do we as journalists, or just people in media generally, really take up the responsibility of making sure we have an informed citizenry when disinformation and quality information are competing and through entertainment, usually as a vector?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, is mine on, by the way? Just push it up. Okay. Can folks hear me? I think it's on. Sorry, it's hard to tell from here. I agree with everything they said. I think that, one thing that's important for mainstream media to figure out going forward is whether they want to be information-based or for lack of a better word, subjective. One of the reasons Fox News is so influential, and I think will remain influential, is that it's not entirely information-based. It's not just saying, here's what happened. It's saying, here's how you should think about what happened. And it's extremely influential in that. MSNBC tries to do that on the Democratic side and doesn't come anywhere near that level of influence. And so I think going forward for both, more for cable, but for print as well, the question is, it's a number of things. It's what format do you use? How long are your stories? Think about the attention span. People aren't sitting at their kitchen table reading a long news story en masse now the way, certainly like in my generation, my dad would always have a stack of newspapers and get up early, whatever. That doesn't really exist anymore. People still consume information, but it's different media, but it's also, it's shorter. So I think like media has to think about the attention span and then has to really make a decision about, each individual outlet, whether it's cable news or a magazine or a print publication, has to kind of decide, do we want to play it straight? Do we want to be C-SPAN or like a very like non-biased newspaper, or do we want to take a side? And you saw that play out. You saw that conundrum play out with the decision to pull endorsements. The LA Times and I think the Washington Post both were prepared to endorse Kamala Harris and didn't. I guess the cynical view is they didn't think she was going to win and they didn't want to be out of favor with the person they thought would win. But there is also a sort of more macro question for media about like, what direction do we want to go in terms of like trying to influence the audience, the reader. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I think Fox will remain relevant as long as, well, it'll be interesting to see because Trump and Fox had a number of fallings out, but I think Fox will remain relevant. The New York Post in New York is very relevant for the same reason. It's very brash and it's saying, here's the information to justify how you should think or to justify how you already think. The Democrats don't quite have an equivalent level of influence on, their more friendly media outlets. So I don't know if that's exactly what your question was, but I think that's an important thing to kind of think about regarding politics in the media going forward.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is, what do you do going forward? There've been some well-reported meetings that Trump has had with some media personalities, with some seasoned reporters. Is that the right thing to do? How do you cover the Trump administration?
So I think there's two different, are you referring to the MSNBC hosts? Going to see Trump for personal reasons when you're a member of the media is problematic. Covering Trump is necessary. You have to go to his press conferences and ask him questions. You have to talk to people who work for him. You have to cover him and cover what he's doing and, try to do it fairly and objectively. So if one were to go to Trump to do an interview, that's not problematic. What you're referencing is, I think, something separate where there was I don't know the full story. But
I think Maureen Dowd also went and visited him recently. And I'm just questioning, apparently for a long period of time, she did not want to visit him, sort of didn't want to be influenced by the personality. And this is just my words, not hers, but decided now was the time. And so it is now the time to meet with him. And how does that influence the reporting?
You also have this phenomenon of course, Sally referenced the newspaper is not endorsing. And, you have the phenomenon of the media owners themselves trying to, curry favor with the incoming president. And I think, you have this happening in an environment as well where, you have a lot of what right now is bullying, right? Whether it's the threats that Nick just talked about from the likely FBI nominee, or from Trump himself, where he is explicitly promised to go after media organizations that he feels he's contending have not been fair or do not align with with his own agenda or need to dominate the conversation. And, so it's a very kind of tentative and kind of, I feel like as journalists, we're holding our breath, kind of wondering how much is this kind of schoolyard bullying of the kind that is very, very familiar from Trump, and how much is this a promise of actions that could be really different this time? And how is it going to play out? Is it going to play out in First Amendment fights, right, where we're going to have to then be in court all the time, and then like everything else that's politicized and thrown into the courts creates a really chaotic and frightening situation? How much does that manifest in self-censorship, whether that's individual journalists or institutions? I mean, there are all of these questions in the air. So to get back to your question, in the meantime, we do our jobs the best we can. I know this sounds very like truth, justice, and the American way, but I really believe that very sincerely. We just do the work and do it accurately and forcefully without fear or favor. And, we'll deal with each challenge as it comes up.
Austin?
I mean, at the risk of sounding cynical, I do worry sometimes that, with our commitment to accurate reporting and, really detailing, I guess, what's real and what's not as far as a Trump administration. I mean, I think we've seen that not have an effect that was really tangible for a while now. I mean, I'm not sure what the solution looks like for that, but I think as a journalist, I really do wonder, I mean, if going over every single word and saying this is true and this is not doesn't actually change minds or open eyes. I mean, what is left?
Mm-hmm. So let's bring all this back to New York. Were you surprised by any of the results in New York, be it Long Island is truly Trump country now? I mean, I think Nassau, Trump won by 5%. I think in Suffolk, he won by 11%. But on Long Island, you had Laura Gillen beat Anthony D'Esposito in Congress by, I think, over 2 points. So that was a huge win. Then other congressional races, you had Mark Molinaro lost. So you had, it was an interesting evening in New York, actually a couple days after when all the results were said. But what's your take on the national elections' impact on New York, and what does it mean going forward?
I mean, I think what we saw in New York on election day was what we saw across the country, which is Democrats don't actually seem to have a concise sales pitch to voters. And as a result, they lost any, narrative control of their party, their platform, what they stand for, their values. I mean, that election or attack ad rather, against Kamala, that I guess tried to hone in on transphobic thoughts in society. I mean, that worked, I think, because Democrats forgot how to talk to people. I mean, that should have been easy to sort of just, explain as nonsense. But I think when you're in a position where no one actually looks to you as a party for information or solutions, I think you've lost the battle before you even get to November.
I think your question was, were you surprised? And I certainly wasn't. And that's in part, like I live in Brooklyn, and I live right on the border between, when you look at the results, between blue Brooklyn and red Brooklyn, right? So everything south of me was totally red. And I could have easily predicted that for a variety of reasons. And then, to the north was Harris country. And I think it was not surprising at all, both because you had a number of issues where Trump had, this sort of speaking to what Austin was talking about, like a consistently strong message on issues of concern, like very straightforwardly on crime, and this may seem surprising, that the message on immigration, even though it's these are very immigrant communities in New York City that often turned out for Trump, there is a sort of us versus them kind of sense within immigrant communities of, well, we did it the right way, and these newcomers are not. You also have, and we can, would love to talk more about this. You also have the Democratic Party within New York City had, in a variety of ways, really showed signs of not really having the focus, and not just on not turning out the vote in the way it conventionally had, but it's sort of relying on, and this is different for each county, you know, each has its own machinery, but really kind of protecting its own leadership and prerogatives and kind of legacy troops such as labor, but not really bringing it all together in a way that was really meaningful for enough people and communities. It has become a kind of very insular game. So I think, you know, there were a lot of reasons that we can unpack, but I do think it was a combination of, you know, the sort of clarity of message really turning out a lot of people. And as across the country, you really have this huge turnout gap where, you know, Trump performed more or less as he had previously, and it was the Democrats who stayed home. That certainly played out in New York City. You have, you know, a lot of people who are increasingly, you know, not registering with a particular political party. And if they turned out, they were often turning out for Trump. So you just had, I think, this sort of both failure of membership and mobilization at the grassroots of the Democratic Party for a whole host of reasons. But I think is you know, if the Democratic Party is going to, and it will, you know, eventually recover some bearings, it's going to have a lot to do with reckoning at the grassroots. And the grassroots are very dry right now in New York City.
And yeah, I agree. And I'm sorry, your question was just whether kind of we were surprised by the results in New York. I too wasn't. The three, you know, the interesting thing about New York is that Trump did much better in the city and in the state than he did in 2020. And yet 3 Democrats won House seats that were held by Republicans. So you had, you know, these cross currents. Laura Gillen won, and Josh Riley won in the Hudson Valley, and in Syracuse, Mannion beat Brandon Williams. And then you had Pat Ryan defeat a Republican challenger by a pretty big margin, I think 13 points. So, you know, even though that wasn't, he's the incumbent, you know, that was still considered a pretty big victory. So even with, and I agree with Alyssa, I think the state party is weak. And the governor is a weak leader for a number of reasons, and the mayor is compromised. And Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are, you know, New York based, but they're very DC focused. And even without a kind of like consummate New York Democratic leader of great strength and popularity, New York Democrats still did pretty well in these House seats. And that was completely contrary to how they performed throughout the country and how Trump performed. So Trump, I want to say he improved his margin by 11 or 12 points in New York State, and I think by 7 or 10 points in New York City. I believe Kamala Harris, her turnout in New York City was like something like 500 or 600,000 fewer votes than Biden had in 2020. Does that sound right? It was really massive, the fall off. And so it's interesting, and I have theories as to why this happened, but I don't know exactly which one is true or if any of my theories are true. But it is really interesting that New York was this kind of like bright spot for Democrats in these House races, despite Trump doing better, and despite the state party and the governor and the mayor being really just across the board very politically weak. So that's an interesting thing to study. I think the winning candidates focus, I think they did have good messages. They distanced themselves from Biden. I think all of them did. Certainly Pat Ryan, who I kind of focused on a lot in my own like sort of mental postmortems because he did well. He had called on Biden to drop out quickly. And he's an interesting guy to kind of think about. He's like a veteran and you know, in some sort of traditional senses, moderate, but he also campaigned with AOC on environmental issues, and he took a kind of populist economic message. But I think, you know, having the right, it sounds so obvious, but like having the right messaging and being authentic are things the Democratic Party needs to do writ large and in New York as well to stop this, you know, the encroachment of Republicans in New York is a serious problem for the Democrats.
So you all made mention of the Democratic Party, the challenges in the future, what happens now. So what happens to the Democratic state chair, Jay Jacobs? Does he stay in power? Is he pushed more to the progressive side, or was he right at the end of the day because he had these wins in congressional seats?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a great case based on this particular election for pushing him out. There are people who don't like him and may try to push him out anyway. I thought, as I said, I think the state party, they got a win on the Equal Rights Amendment that was in danger. That was sort of a symbolic effort to codify abortion rights and other things that are in the state constitution. That was actually in danger at a certain point. And they won that, and they picked up these 3 seats. So there are people who want Jay Jacobs gone and may still push for that, but I don't know that they have the strongest case they will ever have at this moment, because the Dems did, they performed decently. And he wasn't Trump's New York chairman,
Right.
He's not, or I'm sorry, Harris is New York chairman. So he's not responsible, kind of personally or as a state party for how much better Trump did this time than he did in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the pressure to get rid of Jacobs is from the left, right? And it's sort of been, and you had that moment in 2018 when you had this progressive wave that took out, the IDC that had allowed for this division. This is getting in the weeds, so I'll try to keep this straightforward. But basically, there was a kind of governing coalition of centrist Democrats with Republicans that allowed Republicans to have a functional majority in the state Senate. And this was very frustrating to people on the left for many years. And 2018 was a very big year. Not only was it the year that AOC won election in Congress, but you also had a number of state senators, such as Julia Salazar, other folks who won those seats as well. And so ever since then, representatives and their supporters from that faction of the Democratic Party have been trying to push Jacobs out. I would argue that he's sort of since Cuomo got pushed from office and sort of in this sort of wilderness we've been in the kind of in the COVID era and a lot of other disruptions, Jacobs is kind of this legacy force along with Hochul and others who are keeping things on this kind of center keel, as you're seeing, certainly outside of New York City. I don't know how it breaks down in terms of, you take out New York City, would Trump have won New York State? I don't know if anyone here has done the math, but certainly Jacobs is in the unenviable position of trying to keep New York sort of more or less together as a democratic state. So, so you do have that. And the question I think really becomes like, you do have a very active left that is trying to really be felt in New York politics, and how you kind of square that with a party that is trying to stem losses and trying to keep people registering as Democrats, turning out in general elections, all of that stuff. I think that is a big challenge for Jacobs to continue to navigate, and not just reactively, right? Like proactively. What do you do with that to build strength?
Well, since you mentioned the Senate, maybe Austin, you can jump in here from an Albany perspective. What impact do you think, if any, it's going to have on Democrats going forward, the fact that they no longer have a supermajority in the Senate? Does it matter?
I mean, I think the loss of a supermajority, it wasn't dramatic. It was just, I think, more of a technicality. That being said, I don't think there's a world where they don't go into session next January much more aggressive. In part because I think they would want to show that they can actually provide results, actual legislation that does things for communities. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, they're just looking for something to show the electorate as a sort of signal that we are for, the quote unquote people, as opposed to, I think, conservative sort of narratives that they are the party of the working class. I mean, that has to be turned around at some point.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know this isn't directly related to the question, but just reacting to that. I think one of the huge stories of this election for the Democrats is I think there is really a foundational assumption that the voters understood the New Deal legacy, understood the Great Society, understood Obamacare, understood that these sort of generations of government provision were brought by their party, and that they were the keepers of the flame for things that people really do value and really need in their lives. And I think that the sort of that, for me as a journalist to sort of look at the narrative contrast between the parties around one party that was very clear about what it stood for, and another that, again, there's just been some kind of generational lapse that we've seen, where I do truly feel that the generations coming up now and voting just have no idea. The education system doesn't help them there. The media certainly does not, because people are just deluged with, all barraged with not just information, but analysis that tells them everything but like, here's the history and how it happened. And so I think that is, there's a sort of question for us as journalists around sort of what does that mean? And it's not a partisan question to ask, what does it mean when people forget history and don't understand it? Because I don't think that's the only reason for the results, but the sort of like the lapse in understanding of like what the parties actually stood for. People literally couldn't say what the Democrats stood for, except for being that Harris was just opposed to Trump and Trump would be bad. But what she stood for was much harder to articulate.
I mean, I realize the irony as I say this from an Ivy League campus, but I mean, State Senator James Sanders, he told me, I think maybe the day after the election, how the party forgot how to talk to non-college educated voters. And I mean, I think that's, as you're saying, like just the sort of lack of education understanding around what the party stands for. I mean, that has to be communicated in newer, more effective ways.
Sally?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, what was the original question?
Well, we've
I keep just
meandered.
riffing.
Actually, we were asking about the impact of the lack of the supermajority in the Senate.
Oh, okay.
Does that matter?
Yeah, I kind of agree. I don't think so. I don't think it'll matter too
Mhm.
much. And in terms of, what Alyssa was saying, it's a real problem how little people understand history. And that is a problem for Democrats, that people don't realize they are the party, we're the party of unions. But I would say that the Democrats maybe don't have, not only do they not have the messaging, they don't necessarily have the policies. Some do, it's a bifurcated party. That makes life hard for them. There's an active left and everybody else. But I think what the election showed was it's not just so much left and center in the Democratic Party. It's like populist versus elite. And this was an election, and I think 16 to some extent was as well, and 20 was the anomaly for Trump. These are elections about the elites. And there's a lot of contradictions in that. I mean, Trump was born into wealth. To say that he's a man of the people is comical because the facts don't bear that out. It doesn't really matter for politics, though. He speaks to people in a way that makes them feel like he understands the regular working man or woman. And Democrats definitely don't have the messaging, don't have the messengers, and don't always have the policy solutions, or in this case, I thought, a good explanation to people for why Trump's policies will not benefit. I mean, those particular voters. You can't really credibly have a coalition of the wealthiest people, Elon Musk, the wealthiest person in the world, I believe, and also, and policies that will help them, and policies that will help, your kind of like Appalachian, down on their luck union worker. Like those two things can't square unless you're a very good salesman, which Trump obviously is. And the Democrats didn't do, in my opinion, a very good job of saying, actually, tariffs are going to be terrible for you, working person, and we are the party of unions. Now, there's an education question in that, because I read somewhere that a large number of voters don't know what a tariff is, which is super concerning about, the education system and all of that. But there wasn't, there was a lot of like, messaging around abortion that was successful for Democrats. They really fell down on messaging on economic concerns, both here's what we do for you, here are our policies, and here are why his policies don't work. I think Bernie Sanders probably is the most high profile person who messages that in a way that I believe is effective, notwithstanding other things people may or may not like about him. AOC, to an extent, I think, talks about the economy in a populist way. But largely, the party was very reactive certainly on the border, and kind of reactive on economic concerns without really, but to your point, like without reminding people, like, hey, the Democrats are they're the reason you have a union and union protections. So I don't know. I'm just kind of talking. I don't know that that's an answer. I don't think the state Senate majority is super.
And what about Hochul? What does that look like going forward? mean, is she weak?
Very. She's extremely weak. Her numbers are bad. I don't actually understand, and I read, write, and edit stories about her all day long. I don't totally understand why her popularity is so low and why she is so weak. She doesn't have like a major scandal like Eric Adams. She hasn't had like a huge problem. It's not like there was some, massive strike she mishandled or a snowstorm where everyone was, whatever, the things that really tank a politician. But she didn't like climb the ladder in a typical way. So she doesn't have these really strong relationships with different groups you get when you start out as, she was in Congress, but she's sort of an accidental governor. She was appointed lieutenant governor by Cuomo, and then, he resigned and she became governor, and really didn't, had a tough general election 2 years ago. So she doesn't have like the political chops or relationships. And there's this huge anti-incumbent sentiment that, is not her fault, but she certainly doesn't benefit from it. I think congestion pricing was problematic for her, the way she kind of flip-flopped around on that. But she's very weak, and she's got people coming for her hard on every side. Mike Lawler, who just won re-election as a Republican, who defended his seat against Mondaire Jones, seems like he's running as a Republican. Richie Torres, congressman from the Bronx, is considering a primary challenge to her. Possibly Andrew Cuomo.
What about Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman?
Yes.
Yes. He'd be a pretty viable candidate.
He might be like a Trump endorsed candidate. I could see
I know he has his reelection to county exec coming up next November. So probably one thing at a time, but definitely would imagine he would deliver Long Island.
Well, on this question of Hochul, I think Sally, you're exactly right to bring up congestion pricing as an example. And she has this tendency that I think has not served her well or served New York well, where she's trying to be smart about the politics. And in that case, the reason ostensibly, or, that she was, she put this pause on congestion pricing for New York City was specifically, and, the wisdom of this politically may have been borne out, right? She was protecting these congressional seats and really trying to support Democrats in those districts and not trying to make her party look bad, and trying to insulate the candidates from attacks about the congestion fee. And now is bringing it back, although at a lesser amount. But I think it's a really interesting, case study, because it's, she's, New York City utterly depends on the subways being funded and this, the congestion fee generating a significant amount of revenue. And even that is not adequate to what the system actually needs. And, so she made this, you can call it a flip-flop around the fee. But, it kind of has created this kind of permanent opening against her and the program, because rather than standing up and taking a position and saying, well, this is crucially important, we must stand by this. And she sort of gave lip service to that, but her actions said something else. And her actions said, well, she'll just kind of bend with the political situation. And there really isn't a principle underlying it, nor does she care about the New York City subways. Or the transit system's viability in general. And I think we've seen her operate this way a lot, particularly when it comes to New York City. I just don't think she really understands New York City. She might even be afraid of it. And then sort of her information about how to govern the city, which is a significant part of her state, is just kind of filtered through like, okay, she's here sometimes. I think she was here today, but I don't really feel like she truly understands it in a way where she can appropriately govern. And I think that's a piece of the weakness, but that's the part of it I see as someone who covers New York City.
Could I just say like one quick thing? That's a really good example of like this elite versus working class divide. Kathy Hochul should be able to say, working class people ride the subway. Right. And the idea that Mike Lawler is like driving in his car saying like, I'm the poor worker and you elitists take the subway is like, again, facts don't always bear that out. Plenty of working class people take the subway. She should be able to say, if she believes in the policy, which I'm presume whether she does or not, she's going to have to fake it till she makes it because it's now her policy. But she should be able to say, like, this is for, you know, the home health aide riding the 4 train early in the morning to the Upper East Side. Like, this shouldn't be like she's allowing, and she's not the only one. I'm just picking on her because I cover her. But, you know, Democrats are allowing the Republican Party to say, like, you're all elitist when there are congestion pricing could easily be flipped on its head from a messaging point of view. You're never going to tell someone it's great that you're paying a $9 toll. That is hard politics for like Long Island drivers. But she could say to New York residents in the Bronx who are taking the subway to a job in Manhattan, this is going to improve your trip. This is actually like we're taxing people who have the means to buy a car and drive it so that your public transit, which is not an elite system, you know, is better. And she's not making that case at all. And she's letting Mike Lawler really just pummel her on this issue. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
And I think part of her, fundamental weakness too, is just that, you know, she's, I think made no secret of the fact she's okay with pissing off progressives, sort of alienating segments of New York City politics, but it's at no advantage or gain to her sort of likability upstate. I mean, I don't understand how there wasn't maybe more soul searching around the fact that, you know, you have someone like Pat Ryan who can eke out a win in Orange County and, you know, the Mid-Hudson Valley, yet at the same time, she is anemic there. I mean, I think there might have been opportunity for her to frame herself as, you know, the voice of upstate New York, which is, you know, a popular sales pitch in some cases, but I think she's essentially lost the plot in that way. I mean, I don't think there's anything she can do or say to sort of convey the idea that I stand for this region of New York versus that region, or I'm listening to you guys and I want to help. I think she's just the governor.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to what we were talking about a little bit in the national political sphere, but she very much embodies it here in New York, which is that Hochul is afraid, I can't read her mind, but she acts like she's afraid to stand for something, right? And the values that she does stand for are ones that are kind of legacy Democratic Party values, but they're not speaking to these very pressing concerns that people have. And this is where I think that the sort of Democratic sort of platform on these key issues is both the right platform on principle, but also very problematic politically, where you don't have clear answers on things that people are pressing about. On the economy, yes, they could have made more effective rebuttals as a party, but specifically on in New York, for her, it's definitely immigration and crime. And it's like, how do you, unless you really have genius sales skills, how do you as a governor try to speak to the people of New York and say, well, you're going to do something about these things? You sort of, what she's done on a number of issues is really tinkered on the margins and come out with a lot of press releases or taken stands, but can't speak as a governor to sort of these core issues. And that's, I think the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do around, okay, what are we at the state level, at the local level, at the national level? How are we going to come out strong on this and not just sort of say, well, we're the good guys, that. So, that they have to do better than that now.
Okay, so I have one more question to ask you before I think we open it up to the audience. I know for sure, I think there's some students here. And since I work at Cornell, I have to make sure all the students get their questions in first and then everyone else. But my last question, Alyssa, you had mentioned the grassroots for the Democratic Party being not so great right now. Now, having been born and raised in Republican politics, we always looked up to the Democrats as having this great grassroots organization out there, particularly in New York City. But it seems at least in New York and also nationally, Republicans have embraced this idea of early voting. They're getting it out. They kind of messed that up the last election. And like, for example, led by Nassau County Chairman Joe Cairo, really got the troops out there. But all of you see that the Democrats can get that back, or do you think it's sort of dying on the vine?
I'll jump in since, you know, I had raised that before. I mean, I'll just give you a case study of a story that we covered at the city. I think Politico covered it as well, but I think it's really instructive. And this is also from Brooklyn. And that is that you had a situation where there was a kind of power struggle within the local Brooklyn Democratic Party, where people were challenging the leadership of the party chair. And in order to protect herself against this leadership challenge, she actually went so far, not just you, but the party leadership and lawyers went so far as to go to court to challenge ballot petitions that not only had district leader candidates on them. This gets, again, really wonky, but there were candidates for a sort of party post that were on them who included one of the ringleaders of the effort to challenge her, but also included a former state assemblyman who was trying to run for election in a newly redrawn district, which was, you know, increasingly sort of Republican friendly, but, you know, he would have had a shot. He had a name. He'd served the area for a while. And the court challenge actually got the ballot petitions thrown out, and this candidate could not run for election as a Democrat. And so as a result, the Democratic Party did not have anybody on the ballot in this district in Brooklyn, and it became a Republican district. And this happened in a few other districts where it wasn't quite so dramatic, but where basically the party refused to support people that weren't like purely loyal to the party leader. So I don't know if that's a very specific Brooklyn issue, but I do think that it's pretty indicative of the ways in which the sort of party leadership is kind of leading for themselves and not looking at the sort of strength of the party overall. At least that's the takeaway I had from that particular situation.
I mean, from what I saw like this last cycle, it seems like there is, you know, still the ability to sort of grassroots organize within the party. It's just not coming from the party. It's coming from candidates and their own campaigns. I mean, I think the idea that Josh Riley could somehow turn out voters across that district, which seemed to be from Canada to Massachusetts. I mean, the voters will come out. I think it's just they have to believe in the candidate. They won't come out to vote for Democrats in general. That's not happening anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an interesting commentary because, you know, political parties, the idea of them is that they are larger than the candidate and, you know, more than the sum of their parts, right? And maybe this is just an era of personalities. I mean, because, you know, famously Trump has kind of hijacked the Republican Party, and it is the Trump Party, and we don't know what the future of the Republicans is separate from Trump either. So maybe it's just a reality of the present moment.
Well, speaking of the future, any students here who have questions? Any Cornell students? Any other students? Anyone else with questions? Yep. Do you want to take this? Sure. Just keep that little switch up.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a bit of an obstreperous question, so I hope that you will forgive me, and which is also to get a little bit of thoughts from you all about how the media has done. Austin, I noted your comment that you felt that the Republicans were being transphobic nonsense by talking about transgender issues. I have covered these issues and spoken to very mainstream Americans who do not want their daughters to compete with biological males on sports teams, nor to have individuals with penises in the locker room with their girls. 10 years ago, when this issue started, they could say, oh, those are fantasies, that's silly, that could never happen, it's just one person, and it has not played out that way. And I'm a science writer, so I have looked at the science of biological male strength versus female. It's extremely difficult to write about because of views like that it's transphobic, immediately dismissing this. And so I want to ask for you as a journalist, if you've really looked into this and spoken to voters about their feelings. It's very easy to dismiss as a Republican talking point, but what are reporters actually doing to really get out there and report on people's feelings about it?
Well, I mean, to be extremely clear, you know, in saying it was transphobic nonsense, it was specifically the line that Kamala cares about what they, them, not you or us. I can't remember the exact phrasing. Only in the sense that, I mean,
Policies have done that. If you look at Title IX and the changes,
I
they have
understand.
done that.
I understand that, but the rhetoric is essentially saying she cares about the LGBTQ community more than actual people, which is a weird distinction to make, I think. I mean, it worked, don't get me wrong, but I think it was going at the lowest version of the argument, which unfortunately was some dangerous rhetoric in some cases.
I got to tell you, the Democratic Party needed to respond, and Kamala Harris needed to defend her actual legislation on the ground that she has supported, and they did not. They were completely silent. It was a very powerful issue that Democrats simply dug their heads in the sand. And by the way, I have seen a change in tone in reporting in the New York Times that has now actually become, it seems to me, more even-handed and really exploring the issues. This has happened very recently, whereas 2 years ago, their reporting was very opinionated, and I'm actually seeing it improve on this issue.
Well, I mean, I think over time too. I mean, as the sort of idea of trans women in sports has sort of evolved. I mean, the views of parents are becoming more and more present, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it necessarily should be the only voice as we report out these issues.
Yeah, I think that the politics of, and it's not, I think there's a very similar thing that went on around the politics of COVID and, the controversies around that, right? Where you had the Democrats take positions where, the Democratic default is going to be, we want to do things to help people we consider to be, a minority and oppressed group, somebody we want to help, and let's find a policy to help them, right? And I think it comes in with very good intentions. Well, people are at risk of health problems, let's shut things down. People, you have people who have gender dysphoria or real needs here, let's address it. Let's try to have policies that will, in a sort of broad sweeping way, address this. I do think they come with very good intentions and with all the right ideas about how to help people in society who need to make sure they're on equal footing with other folks, right? But then dealing with the externalities of all of that, right? Okay, you do that. You change the policy, you shut things down. You then are in a position of having, as you're saying, actually own the results of all of that, right? And I think that's where the political opening came in for Trump and the Republican Party to say, okay, well, we have answers for you. And they're not, they're very different answers, right? And they're not, they come from a very different set of values. So stepping back from that and to say, what does that mean for us as journalists? It's to, first of all, talk about it and acknowledge it and understand that we all come from certain frames of reference ourselves that we have to examine when we're reporting on these issues. And we just have to be out there reporting the facts of them. But I think that it's like, should it, I guess the question in terms of covering the election, right? Should any, I think it's a very difficult kind of, question of like where it kind of comes up in the coverage of the election, right? At what point does an editor go to a reporter and say, okay, let's do a trend or lifestyle piece or political piece around how this is playing out? How do voters feel about this issue, right? Who is making that decision in the newsroom? And are our newsrooms places where we can feel like we can assign stories that might get into these difficult places? So I think that's the important thing for us to do as journalists. Yeah.
Post, now that Trump has won and the die is cast, now I'm seeing journalists follow.
Right. No, these are important and very, very, very hard questions because it forces us to not to sort of go into places where, you might get accused even for raising the questions, and the Times certainly got attacked for taking on, even talking to anybody who might have questions about transgender surgery or so on and so forth.
Yeah, I kind of agree that there was not a good answer that Democrats had, because I don't think that I don't know that they wanted this issue, but they took it on anyway. And I'm sorry? Oh, you can, okay. And, it's an issue that's relatively new in the public consciousness. And it's become an issue that Democrats feel the need to defend, whether or not they view it as a primary concern for most Americans, which I would venture to guess it's not. I mean, polling shows consistently Americans are worried in this election about the economy, the border, immigration and public safety. And trans rights doesn't ever rank as a top issue for your average voter. I'm sure for some people it does, but for the vast majority of Americans, it doesn't. And yet Democrats, somewhat by choice and somewhat by their own sort of poor politics in terms of how they message things, for a number of reasons, some misinformation, some real information, they found themselves in a position of having to defend an issue that I think many of them in public office didn't understand, didn't really want to defend, but kind of had to anyway. And frankly, I think many of them don't really know a lot about the issue. And in that gap of, in that space of not knowing, Republicans came in with, as Alyssa said, with answers and with messaging. And it was very effective. And you're now seeing, I was really interested in an interview that Sarah McBride, who is the trans congressperson from Delaware, did with Face the Nation. I just saw a clip of it on Twitter, X, whatever. And the interviewer said, how do you feel about being in a party with Tom Suozzi, who says, trans women should not play on biological boys' teams? And Sarah McBride was like, we should really be talking about economic concerns. And I thought that was telling, because this is someone who's lived this life, has gone through the gender change surgery. I don't know the exact right word, but I think everyone knows what I mean, and is a trans person and is saying, I'm actually here to talk about your pocketbook issues. And I thought that was telling for Democrats. I don't think too many of them wanted to make it the front and center issue. I think they found they found themselves in a position they didn't want to be in often. But I thought it was like a telling answer that, I mean, she certainly wasn't like running away from her own identity, but rather saying like, this really isn't the primary reason people elected us. This isn't the main thing we should be talking about. And so I don't know, where it goes from there for Democrats. It's a very tough issue. It really gets into also, what do you tell kids in school? At what age do you tell kids things? Do you tell kids things before their parents have told them? Is that fair to the parents? It brings up a lot of issues that are very personal to people, and it's not so simple. So I don't have a good answer other than I just thought that clip was very interesting.
Any other questions? Back there. Yeah, just keep that up so we hit the volume. Yeah, just keep that.
Hi, everybody. Question on the impact of the 2024 election on the upcoming mayoral race. What impact or effect do you think that will have? And also, do you think that Donald Trump may try to find a way to interfere with the election? Note I said interfere and not endorse. And I can explain the distinction, but I just want to know what you guys think.
I think it's helpful to Mayor Adams that Trump was elected. So a number of things can happen technically. I'll just run through them quickly. If this trial, I assume everybody knows, Eric Adams was indicted in a 5-count bribery case by the Southern District of New York. That prosecutor is leaving or has left already, and Trump put someone else in. And Trump has spoken positively about Eric Adams, and Eric Adams has spoken positively about Donald Trump. So that's kind of the, just to level set what's happening. So a number of things can happen. Either the trial can go forward and Eric Adams can beat the charges. That would probably be his best political situation, because then he doesn't owe Trump anything, which is not a position you necessarily want to be in a Democratic primary in New York City in an off-cycle year, where like the most dyed-in-the-wool voters are going to come out. Or Trump could have the Southern District kind of slow walk or sort of disappear this case. I don't know how that works. I mean, that seems dicey, but who knows? Or he could get convicted and Trump could pardon him. I think Trump's assent is good legally for Eric Adams. It's tricky politically because in a Democratic, so Trump won 30% in New York City, much better in statewide, but 30% in New York City. That's in a general when you have more independent voters and Republican voters coming out. In a New York City primary, it's historically been a further to the left, left of center electorate, a very small, very committed electorate, and people who I would assume, based on voting patterns, would not particularly take kindly to Eric Adams being viable because he was helped by Donald Trump. So helpful legally, tricky politically would be my answer.
So there is, I mean, there's a non-zero possibility, although Sally may slap me down on this and I would deserve it, but I think there's a non-zero possibility that Adams runs as a Republican.
I don't think that's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, if ever there was a time to run as an independent or a Republican, but his base is very, I mean.
That's right. But you think about, like, you know, Mike Bloomberg paid dearly to get on the Republican line, the Independence Party line that had existed then. I mean, it's a real advantage for a candidate with high name recognition or a lot of money or both to run as a Republican. So I wouldn't rule that out,
Yeah,
certainly.
he doesn't have that kind of money, but.
Right. And he can't, I mean, there's for a lot of reasons he can't raise it. He may not get matching funds now because of the federal case and the campaign finance board problems and so forth. But I think the other thing it may mean, besides this wild card possibility that I've conjured up that Adams could run as a Republican, I think you're also going to possibly see a lot of financial pressures and political pressures on New York City. And I think one thing it may do, speaking to what Sally was just talking about the Democratic primary base, is really drive the electorate to the left. And you have a lot of candidates who are already kind of very much vying for that, right? And you've seen the entrance of candidates like Zoran Mondani, who has a very explicitly socialist platform, and Jessica Ramos and other candidates. So I think another outcome we could see is this kind of reaction of saying, you know, we're going to manifest resistance in New York through this political process, and there'll be a lot of competition to the left. So either of those, I mean, those are just two of the possibilities, but those are two I'm looking to see, you know, what comes next.
I mean, admittedly, you both dwarf my understanding of New York City politics, but I do always go back to this idea that I've heard from some progressives that the entire reason that Eric Adams got in office was because the progressive vote was split up and fractured. And I mean, in a situation where the electorate's pushed left by, I guess, Trump and just everything else going on, I mean, I don't know for a fact that they would sort of coalesce around one person and learn their lesson. So.
Yeah, we have ranked choice voting. And so this again speaks to, and Sally and I were just talking about this before the panel, you know, we have a situation where you have numerous candidates competing in the primary, and not as in this environment in which news organizations, right? We're sadly fewer and fewer, you know, newsrooms and people covering the news, and people are not necessarily tuning into local news when they have a gazillion things coming into their phone. And so how the public, how voters actually distinguish between a large field of candidates and make an informed ranked choice decision, I think is a really, it's a lingering question right now about the race as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. So as someone who is Gen Z and like looking at the overview of what's happened during the election, one word is just kind of disappointment for me, honestly speaking, and a concern. And with conversations that I have with my peers who, you know, went to school, have the degree, and kind of we went from having a gist of understanding how politics works and how it affects us to kind of, I guess you can say, radicalized now and really understanding what's at stake. And, you know, with the landscape of media continuing to advance and to get better, and also adding on, as someone who is a journalist, who went to school, who has a degree, who understands how to differentiate from what's real news and what's fake. And, you know, speaking to my peers who, not only some who didn't go to school, or for some peers who are educated but are just checked out from news, don't care for it, they're nonchalant towards it. I'm curious to know, what are efforts that, you know, seasoned journalists as yourselves are continuing to make efforts to reach my generation and getting us to understand what's at stake? Because I had teachers who were millennials who, they understood what was at stake, and it was instilled in me, like education, going to school, doing the research, reading. So to me, it got translated to me. And generally speaking, I also kind of feel like for my generation, we kind of adopted this attitude that things are okay now. Like we have the easy way of things. And with the result of the election now, it seems as though, we thought things were good. It's something that we don't have to keep fighting for when it's an attitude and it's an effort that has to be continuous. So I know you touched on it briefly with podcasting being a new form of media, but what are other ways where for Gen Z who consumes their media through content, how can we make that transition towards news for us to really get what's important versus kind of paying attention to what's entertaining to us or, what's funny or what's trending?
Such a good question. I mean, if anyone could answer that question, they would be very successful in the media landscape. I know like Politico and I think other outlets do use social media, Instagram and TikTok to get stories out. But it's hard. I don't really know how to bridge that divide because I don't know newspapers are just so passé at this point. But even like, I think watching the evening news, just things that like, and probably you as well, when I grew up, it was like evening news was on all the time. Newspapers stacked up it was just part of life in a way that it's not anymore. And I think news organizations that are more mainstream, that aren't, the podcasts, need to figure out a way to distill information for a younger audience in, shorter bursts in new mediums, whether it's TikTok or other apps that I haven't even heard of because I'm old, but I think like news organizations have to be creative because they are going to, there's a threat of getting overtaken by, the influence of podcasters is large and growing. That's not a bad thing, but if you're at a more mainstream outlet, you do have to kind of figure out how to and a lot of organizations are starting their own podcasts. Politico is a podcast. I think the Wall Street Journal has one. I feel like they're pretty common. I know like you guys partner, I think, with FAQ. So I think podcasts is one way. I think using, social media apps and distilling the stories. But at the core of what you're saying is like just a disinterest. I don't know how to overcome. I don't know. I can't even relate to it. I watched news my whole entire life. It's why I went into the news business. So I don't know. That is a generational difference.
Yeah, I think this is going to be, and it's going to be a generation, if not longer, long project to kind of build whatever the vehicles are going forward. Because I think it's essential to democracy, obviously, right? To have functioning press, and functioning press includes being able to connect with audiences who vote, right? That to me is a very fundamental equation. So I have two general thoughts in this direction. One is that, I think there's got to be a real reckoning with in some way, whether it's through antitrust or other means, but the monopoly power of the platforms, right? The fact that you can have Google just sort of vacuum up content, turn it into AI, take ad dollars out against it. And we're my organization, we're a nonprofit. We're literally, begging for money, right? And putting out appeals. We don't get money from Google, right? We get maybe a few pennies for ads on our site. So I think that's a very important project that people like Zephyr Teachout, who ran for governor in New York, she has brought that up as an imperative, and I agree with her. I think the other front, and this is kind of how we function now, because we don't have Zephyr Teachout as Attorney General or governor or anything like that. Is to, my organization just works we're online, but we just put out articles and photos. We don't do video. We have social, but it's very much to get our stuff out there. And I don't pretend for a minute like we're reaching the disengaged Gen Z person. Like my child is Gen Z and not reading my stuff. But I have a belief that it's really important to have organizations put good information, reliable information into the information ecosystem, and that it's a collective, collaborative effort, and that there are others along the chain who are communities who have mutual trust, and they know this is good information, we can use it. And I think that the more we can use sort of technology and organizing to create those trust mechanisms, like the better we will fare in the environment we're in with these monopolistic platforms that are unfortunately running everything.
As a fellow Gen Z person, the idea of sort of, I guess, fixing our generation's apathy towards news. I mean, I'm deeply worried. I mean, as I was finishing up my degree, I would ask my friends, you know, what do you think about this issue or that issue? And not only do they not know what's going on, they don't even know who our congressman is. I mean, I think the deeper issue is maybe just as a culture, just beginning to place more value on facts and information, and I guess just, dare I say, being educated about the world around you. But I mean, to reverse what social media has done to us over a generation, I mean, I think you have to start over with a new batch of kids. Like, I don't know how we come back. Because I mean, I could go on, you know, Twitter right now. I could see one of my colleagues post something that's very useful, you know, but, you know, put on social media to get out there faster and more effectively. And right under it, just pure misinformation that will be believed by a bunch of people as a fact. And it's a problem, but like not a big enough of a problem that's actually like being fixed by anybody, nor raised as a major issue. I mean, I think there's been a casual just dumbing down of young people, and I don't think the news industry has a way to sort of combat that or even approach it. So
Thank you.
not to say we're screwed. But.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, if I could take a little privilege on the moderator side of things and say that I think that our generation also has a responsibility. I'll say my daughter, who's in high school, 16-year-old who writes for the school newspaper, was initially tasked with writing an article about the debate. And trust me, I read the article. I wanted to make sure for her sake it was completely neutral, and it absolutely was neutral. She was told by the faculty advisor that the school had decided they could not have any articles covering the election because that would be controversial. So we have to engage these kids to encourage them to write about this stuff. And I think so everyone's so afraid of being controversial. And I can tell you this article, I would never, you know, have thrown her in that situation to have it be controversial in this climate. So I think we all have a responsibility to get the Gen Zers engaged. So next question.
Perfect. Hi, Jared from Channel 7. I was wondering if you have any thoughts, given that Governor Hochul is from Erie County and upstate governors are extremely rare. What are your thoughts on potentially having another upstate governor in the future? Or do you think we're pretty likely to keep governors from the New York metropolitan area from here on out after Governor Hochul? Thank you.
Another upstate governor, I personally love it, but it seems like that's a hard feat to pull off. And I mean, as we've seen, I think a disconnect with New York City. I mean, if you don't nip it in the bud early, you can't really get past it. So I doesn't feel likely in the future after her.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't say it's not a possibility, but I think the reason that, you know, it's easier for somebody downstate, it's just there's more votes, you know, it's probably an obvious answer, but there are so many more votes in, you know, in like one assembly district in Brooklyn than in like vast swaths of upstate. And so the connection that people, or, you know, Long Island have to large numbers of voters is just sort of, if they're popular, presumably if you're running for governor, you have decent numbers, it's inherently helpful. So the trick for someone from upstate is, I don't think it would hurt a future candidate that like Hochul is from upstate and isn't particularly popular. It's just that there isn't like you're not walking into that election with a lot of voters who know your name, who, you know, unless you've gotten yourself out there through, you know, earned media separate from your elected office. But she, you know, as I said earlier, she was sort of an accidental governor, you know, she was the lieutenant governor, and then she did obviously win of her own volition in 22, but it's hard to imagine like building that kind of political popularity and power from a district with so few voters when you're going up against, in the next election, it'll be presumably a relatively popular congressman from the Bronx and Mike Lawler from Hudson Valley. So these people have just larger bases. So it's not impossible, but it's a built-in challenge.
Alyssa, you want to add anything? Okay. Any other questions?
Thanks. Hi. We talked a lot about what the Democratic Party did wrong and what it could have done better. And we've touched on the media challenges in reaching the young generation. But is there anything specific that you think that your news outlets did that you missed, that you could have done better, that maybe you weren't in tune with? What would you do differently?
That's a good question. I did not appreciate until we did eventually cover this story, but I did not appreciate until pretty late that the Equal Rights Amendment was in danger of failing. And that's such an important kind of barometer for how voters feel about trans rights, about, trans issues, about abortion. And it was also a little bit of a consultant racket, it turned out. And that's an important issue. Oh, sorry. And that kind of ended up being an important signal for a lot of things, and we covered it like at the end when we kind of discovered like, oh, this is not a slam dunk, which we sort of just assumed it was because the language was crafted in a way that we thought, in a relatively democratic state, it would pass. And it did pass and we did get to it eventually, but that's something that I kind of wish we had known earlier and covered earlier, because I think it spoke to how a lot of races were going to go and how voters were feeling about trans issues and just about a lot of issues in general, about incumbency. So that's one example. There are probably many things that I didn't know about until, I'll always regret not knowing anything about AOC until she won. So I really internalized that one.
It's funny. I had the same experience that I was on the Daily News editorial board in 2018, and we did not endorse in that race, did not talk to anyone. And I always have that fear of like, oh, we're going to make that.
I have deep
mistake
regret
again.
over that race.
Same.
Like, I was like, oh man, I really did not know what the hell was going on.
But but this time around, actually, for my newsroom, we're very specific to the 5 boroughs, and we're also very much about informing voters, right? And we kind of went in knowing that New York's electoral votes were going to be clearly go to Harris. There was not really a scenario in which they were in. And so I feel like this is, I'm sort of surprised reflecting on this question, but I actually feel like we did a really good job in our lane, right? That we were really making sure that people knew what was on these ballot initiatives, that we were making sure, there weren't it wasn't really much in the way of competitive congressional races that were in the 5 boroughs. And it was really just about making sure that people understood the Trump and Harris race kind of through the lens of neighborhoods. And we would go out and talk to people and ask them how they were looking at, we went out to Richmond Hill in Queens, which is like a very, both South Asian, but also Guyanese sort of South Asian descent neighborhood. And there were a lot, very divided between Harris and Trump. We talked to Chinese voters. So I think we did a really good job at the local level. And I think it's just instructive that, we really, my organization, we're very much about staying at the community level and speaking to voters. And I just really, I wish that, we're a small newsroom. We're one of a kind of network of small nonprofit newsrooms around the country. And I feel like we're all in different ways trying to do that work, but we just need more of that. Like there isn't enough of that, with all respect to my colleagues who are sort of dealing more in the realm of like professional political reporting, right? It's really important to not lose that connection to voters.
I really wish that I sort of explored the better late than never approach to sort of voter outreach to voters of color from Democrats this cycle, because I think the signs were there from the beginning. It just didn't feel like it was going to show as dramatically as it ended up becoming. But I think I was hearing stories from maybe March that, like there weren't palm cards printed in the right languages for certain communities. Like these things that seem like no-brainers, it just wasn't happening fast enough, or there was no infrastructure in place. And I mean, I think had, maybe we as, I guess as journalists raised the alarm a bit louder, perhaps, there would have been more, I think, engagement from a wider range of voters.
Next question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm actually a graduate student from William Patterson University. So my question is, do you think gender played a significant role in this election? Because first of all, we have seen that Joe Biden, he was labeled as someone as old and all these things. And when Kamala Harris became the candidate, then all these things were disappeared, and it was said that she has low IQ, she doesn't have idea about the policy. So do you think it was the gender issue, one of the issues, key issues, which fated them as the president?
I mean, I'll just jump in, and it's, I mean, you saw a huge gender gap in the polling, right? Where women were overwhelmingly, not, disproportionately supporting Harris, and men were disproportionately supporting Trump. And this sort of cut across every age, every other demographic, right? And so you have that kind of baked in for all kinds of reasons that have everything to do with it means a whole range of issues having to do with everything from the backlash against Me Too to, obviously Trump's own predations, right? I mean, this guy is a sex offender. And so, I think that you also saw in the results from Hillary Clinton in 2016, I think that there's just always going to be in a presidential election, and with this, sense of this is the commander in chief of the military, that nationally, our political culture, also factoring in the electoral college and all of that stuff, but our political culture just has a harder time with women, right? And that there's always going to be a penalty of a certain amount. I don't think it means that a woman cannot win the White House eventually, but you're just going to lose points, and in a close race, it's going to make a huge difference.
I mean, I definitely think it was a factor, but I think with some of the demographic splits, 92% of Black women voted for Kamala, and then I don't remember the exact number, but much less Black men voted for Harris. I mean, I think some communities of color didn't necessarily see her as a part of the community for a variety of reasons. And I think gender might have just been the tip of the iceberg in some cases.
Yeah, and I think that she actually performed better than Biden would have. It's kind of hard to prove that because, obviously they both couldn't run, but it's, yeah, I mean, I don't really know the answer. I kind of was not surprised, but struck by in every poll, the gender gap was on both sides so large, and that wasn't enough for her. I don't think she lost because she's a woman. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that.
Hello. So I cover the Bronx and only that borough really. And I'm wondering if you have any advice about covering this so-called red wave while still keeping things, I guess, in proportion. So it's just been interesting, following up with, say, the Bronx Conservative Party. They have very, very tiny numbers. It's in the few hundreds or so, but they're growing and they're putting up candidates. They want to put up candidates for everything. Talking to them after the presidential election, it almost seemed like they felt like they were the losing party because Trump didn't win New York outright. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, for me as a local reporter, to be covering this. And yet, do you have any advice or thoughts for keeping things, I guess, keeping things in proportion and not over amplifying, but still, reporting on like the fact that, these candidates are running, that is going to be newsworthy, or reporting on new clubs that are popping up. They say there's going to be a Bronx Democrat or Bronx Republican Dominicans club popping up. So yeah, reporting on these things and kind of how to keep it all in perspective.
I mean, I think it is worth covering the start of a trend. And you can, there's a number of ways to make sure that you're not overstating it. You can do it in an individual story by saying like these three, Republican or conservative party candidates. There's a Bronx conservative party. That's funny. I didn't even, it just sounds so niche, but like, Republican, are they crossover Republican candidates usually?
They usually have as of late, they're trying to put up their own candidates, and like on issues, they do cross over a lot.
Okay.
As a candidates, but they are.
Got it. I mean, I know there's a state Republican, but it's just funny to think that Bronx has like separate from Republicans, its own conservative party. In any case, I think you should cover it if it's an emerging trend. And within an individual story, you can say like, the Bronx is still overwhelmingly Democratic, if that's true, or whatever percentage voted for Harris versus Trump. But, this is, something that, it's kind of like germinating, and we're covering, keeping an eye on it. You can do it in the writing. And also like you can find ways to like put all of these kind of breadcrumbs together into one story. So it's not like a constant deluge of stories, which is like sort of how you build an impression that something is bigger than it is by just like, the New York Post does this very effectively. They just like cover something over and over and over on the front page. And you're like, oh my God, this is the most important thing that's happening. So, you can do it like you can take all of, the candidates in a club meeting and, another pop-up thing and put it all in one story and kind of give it some sober perspective in that story, saying like, this is real, but it's not like, it's real that it's starting. We don't know where it's going yet, but we want to cover the grassroots movement of this conservative party in the Bronx.
Yeah, I think that the fact that you're asking the question is half the battle, right? It's just about having that reflection and, hopefully having editors who kind of share that perspective. I do just think it's important, right, to just be covering politics at that level pretty consistently so that, and I know we have a bias in news toward novelty, right? Oh, here's this, did you know there was a Bronx Conservative Party club? Well, and so on. But I do think that when you have, I mean, and of course the tone is a question as well, but we should be covering the meetings of our county parties, right? These should be open and more open than they are. And that, of course, can lead to negative coverage. And my organization has done our share of it, like when the doors are locked and people are peering in through the glass and trying to find out what's happening in some kind of closed session of a party. Well, that's news too, right? And yeah, that can kind of cut tonally in different directions, but it's really up to the people involved who you're covering to take their responsibility seriously to voters and act in a transparent way. And if we can encourage that culture like across all parties, like great, you've done your job.
Any other questions? One more? All right. Thank you so much. I'll turn over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you all for making time to come out here tonight. And I thought this was a really engaging discussion. I would like to toss you one final point. I'm going to make a very positive one, hopefully. But, we're talking about the apathy that so many people have towards news media, the generational issues that we're facing, the election of a president who is very anti-press. How do we remain emboldened? How do you stay motivated? Because Austin, you raised that point, which I've thought about quite a lot. If I were still a reporter, does this matter anymore? We're reporting facts. It seems like we're telling people about it and they're saying, doesn't really matter. We're still voting, for the other person or whatever it is. So in general, what keeps you all motivated to be a journalist?
I mean, to be frank, I'm not qualified to do anything else at this point. So, I mean, it's just my life now. But I mean, I think every now and then you sort of, I'll find that maybe not even, I shouldn't say the public, but people who it's important that they understand specifically what's actually going on, they seem to be informed. And I know they're a reader. So I think that makes me feel like I'm not just hyping things for goofs, you know?
I mean, I get a tremendous amount of positive feedback from a variety of corners about the work we're doing. And do I wish it were coming from younger people? Do I wish we were able to get out there in more languages? Do I wish a lot of things? Yes, but you got to start somewhere, right? And so I think just really, I really do feel like it's rebuilt. The project is rebuilding a culture of news consumption. And I think we will get there. People have a hunger for it. And it's just a question of sort of technologically and institutionally and culturally, sort of what does that look like? But I am feeling pretty good about the work and pretty fired up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't aim to sway people on how to vote. It's more like I want my reporting and my team's reporting, now that I'm an editor, to inform people so that they know more when they make decisions. And I think covering local news is in that way maybe more satisfying from, you know, you're saying, asking about staying motivated. You know, I definitely feel like I covered the mayor's race in 2021, and like my stories would get, you know, picked up, and some weird stuff about Eric Adams got picked up on like late night TV. And I was like, oh, people are actually like learning some things about Eric Adams, albeit weird things about Eric Adams that you know, that's harder nationally because it's flooded and there are just so many other ways that people get their news. I covered a Republican presidential candidate in 23, Ron DeSantis, and that I really felt it more there, where I was like, oh, no one's reading my like analysis on Politico.com. Like, this does not matter in this room, like what I wrote. I mean, Politico does, but in that particular instance, like what I was writing for this particular crowd and this like very, you know, losing but like hyper right-wing campaign, it didn't feel like as motivating as local news does to me, because I think you have more of an ability to kind of like, it's more textured. Which is not to say that plenty of national writers have a lot of influence, but I do think like covering local news, being in the city, like knowing it, knowing the players, allows you to kind of, I don't know, to cover it with an authority that kind of affords you a level of influence. But it is, you're right. Like there are times where I'm like, does any of this matter? It's like Joe Rogan's podcast is what people are listening to. And I think it's important to remember, it's like, it's not like for us to tell people like, this is a bad person, don't vote for them. It's for us to just say like, this is information you should know before you make your decisions as a citizen. And we can't really control it beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate those answers. I think that being a journalist is one of the most courageous professions that someone can have. I mean, I say this obviously as someone who has a journalism degree, you know, pursued it, but I still feel that passion in educating people who are going into the field for it. And that's one of the reasons why I ask you, because, you know, you're already at a certain part in your career. Some of these folks are just deciding whether I become a journalist. And that's a really tough period right now to say, I'm going to make this leap. So I appreciate the work that you do. And you know, obviously our audience, I think, does, and that's why they're here to hear you tonight. So thank you for keeping up that fight of informing folks, even when we're not always sure if it's getting through, but we do know, as you know, you're saying, there are some people who are definitely reading your work, caring about it, spreading it around. So yeah, so thank you for all of that.